Hello everyone, my name is Cesar Ortiz and I will presenting this research, Stress, Violence and the Fetal Environment, a comparative biocultural analysis of build outcomes in conflict zones. Armed conflict is one of the most severe forms of biocultural diversity. It generates chronic stress, displacements, food insecurity, reduced mobility, and severe barriers to prenatal care. These conditions alter the intrauterine environment and influence fetal growth and development. Because gestation is a sensitive period of plasticity, conflict exposure leaves observable biological signatures in populations. Across the literature, with maternal exposure to violence is low birth weight and in more extreme cases very low birth weight, which increase risk of chronic diseases across the life course. This makes conflict an ideal context to examine human variation under environmental stress. This presentation will be focused on three main questions. The first one, how does conflict affect your outcomes? Um, Identifying biological patterns in populations exposed to armed conflict. The second one, why similar patterns across populations uh, appears consistently in different cultural, geographic, and political contexts. And the final one, what mechanisms explain these effects in a biocultural and physiological manner? To address these questions, I will compare results from Colombia, Palestine, Nepal, and cross-country evidence. However, I have to introduce first the theoretical framework that I will use in this research to interpret these patterns. The first one is developmental origins of health and diseases. Uh, this framework explains how early life environments, especially in stress and nutritional scarcity, shape long-term metabolisms, immunity, and disease risks on fetal bodies. This will predict future environments based on maternal physiology. The second one is biological embedding or embodiment. In this case, maternal stress activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal or HPA axis, which increase cortisol and inflammatory cytokines. This grows the placental and influence fetal growth. Chronic stresses during pregnancy becomes biologically embedded in infants. The tier one is life history theory because under dangerous or unpredictable environments, energy is relocated towards a maternal survivor rather than fetal investment. This produces measurable variation in birth weight and fetal viability. All of these frameworks, these three frameworks, would make us identify how the first trimesters as particularly sensitive in a developmental window. Um, the first case that I will use is in Cauca, Colombia. Cauca is an state located in the southwest of Colombia, specifically in the border of the Pacific Ocean. Unfortunately, this region has been affected by armed conflict, internal armed conflict during 60 years. And its region is characterized by rural isolation, especially indigenous and Afro-descendant populations, and long-term inequality. In this case, Cabra Bautista um, will analyze more than 7,000 beers from 2010 and 2016, linking vital statistics with municipal indicators of conflict intensity. Um, in this case, uh, um, they will identify how conflict exposure will increase in a very low birth weight in the next slide. And what are the key findings of this study? This study shows that exposure to armed conflict significantly increased the probability of very low birth weights. Uh, Being born in a rural uh, conflict affected municipality would increase the odds almost fourfold in 3.686 in this case. Also, having fewer than four prenatal visits in a conflict municipality uh, multiplies the risk more than 10 times of risk of very low beer weights. However, if we see the indigenous communities appear to demonstrate some resilience, potentially uh, due to strong kin networks and localized forms and mutual support. Well, they has been lived there for centuries and generations. The second study examines how Al-Aqsa in Intifada in Palestine between 2000 and 2004, using data of more or less 1,224 viewers during this period. And the focus here is uh, identify the impact of Israeli military actions, especially with fatalities in the first trimester of violence, and how refugee and rural education will be affected in these uh, births. This research identified that exposure to violent fatalities during the first semester significantly increased the probability of low birth weight, um, especially if we compare the values of these with the other trimesters are higher. However, even with the small increases in local fatalities produced measurable reductions in beer weight. If we identify each column, we can see the values differ between them. However, it still affects. Um, However, the effects remain after controlling from prenatal visits, anemia, curfews, or maternal fixed effects. Um, this means urban infrastructure access could moderate the impact, especially with mothers with lower education or refugee status that shows greater vulnerability due to psychosocial stress and medical access. We can see how the urban settings, even with more robust infrastructure compared to rural areas, for example in Colombia, mitigate but not eliminate the biological impact. Um, Also, this case demonstrates how psychosocial stress alone can shape fetal outcomes even when medical access isn't completely restricted. This case explores the Nepalese civil war between 1996 and 2006 um, because it has a strong impact on rural regions. In this case, Valente analyzed uh, uh, around 12,000 pregnancies, focusing not just on birth weight but on fetal loss and sex radius. This gave us a window into deeper biological processes. We see we can see that miscarriage, especially in early pregnancy, increased in the table, especially. However, the male births decrease if we see sex-specific vulnerabilities. Some of the results indicate that conflict exposure during pregnancy increase the probability of miscarriage. Uh, Also, the selection of scarring processes in male fetuses are disproportionately lost during periods of violence, consistent with their higher biological vulnerability. Um, this leads to a temporary decline in male births, an example of population level biological variation emerging under stress. Yeah. Um, Also, the study distinguished between scarring effects. Only more robust fetuses survive. Yeah, we can see this on this graphic. And finally, this can say us how Nepal shows that conflict shapes not only birth weights but who survives to be born, altering population structure. However, it is necessary see what says the global evidence. In this case, Kisley make a systematic review showing consistent increases in low birth weight, preterm birth, and obstetric complications in conflict settings worldwide. Um, on the other hand, Lee and Guyen, using the data of 53 countries, developing countries, they found that conflict exposure in the first semester uh, reduced birth weight by 2.8%. Yeah, and increases the probability of low birth weight in 3.2% points. Yeah, so this is consistent with the other previous studies and demonstrates how the patterns found in Colombia, Palestine, and Nepal are not isolated, and they reflect broad cross-cultural biological responses. Now, bringing all this case together, we can make a comparative analysis. The first one, if we see in the universal patterns, how the maternal stress activates the HPA axis and inflammation. Also, the reduces stress to prenatal care, nutritional insecurity, and mobility restrictions are barriers that will affect the first trimester of sensibility. Now, if we see the context-specific differences, in the rurality, stronger effects in Caucan Nepal than in Palestine in rural areas. The type of conflict, for example, in Colombia, Nepal, versus the episodic military incursions in Palestine that was in urban areas, and the social inequalities because the poorer mothers everywhere experience worse biological outcomes. Despite the geographical and cultural differences, armed conflict generates convergent biological responses, demonstrating that human developmental plasticity is affected here. Now, the implication of this is armed conflict serves as powerful natural experiment for understanding the human biology. Also, it reveals that physiological endeavor before birth illustrates an enormous plasticity of the human organisms under environmental stress. Yeah. Uh, Also, it shows how historical and political events becomes biological across generations, and this integrate human rights and reproductive justice into biological anthropology. Conflict in this case does not only shape societies, literally it shapes bodies. To conclude, I could say armed conflict consistently alters fetal development across global populations. The stronger effects occurs during the first semester with a critical window for fetal programming. These outcomes arise through biological mechanisms involving stress physiology, social inequality, and restricted care. Although context differs to the biological patterns, remain remarkably similar, demonstrating that shared human vulnerability makes us understanding how these dynamics help us uh, better address the physiological roots of inequality and support targets interventions for maternal and child health in conflict zones. Thank you very much.